Hey folks, how you doing on this fine day? Straight to the point, it seems like Knowing Better decided to make another Columbus video. I'm not sure why he would do that, but well, there's issues with this one again, so here's another response. The response of the response of the response of the response on Columbus. Ugh.
I don't really want to rework the old Columbus video, not because it's incredibly inaccurate or I'm embarrassed by it.
So yeah, his video was incredibly inaccurate, as I pretty emphatically showed by basically showing that literally every single point he made was wrong by consulting both primary and secondary academic sources. So I guess he hasn't learned anything. Who knows?
In 2017, the Dakota Access Pipeline was built, and the country's current and past treatment of Native peoples was at the forefront of public consciousness. That year, a number of comedy channels decided to make Columbus Day videos, which I felt took advantage of the general population's lack of detailed knowledge of Columbus. So I decided to respond to some of those videos. I assumed most everyone was already familiar with the general story and popular claims against Columbus. So rather than spend time on that, I just focused on debunking some of the more ridiculous claims.
Here it seems like Knowing Better is kind of like retroactively making an excuse and a motivation for his previous video, but I don't think that really fits with the actual content of his previous video. Because if you watch it very early in the intro,
you probably have one of two views of Columbus. You might think that he was a brave explorer who proved the world was round and by doing so discovered the United States, and if that's the case, congratulations on graduating from elementary school. Now, I know every grown-up says this, but a lot of things are going to change for you, not just for you personally, but for all the things that you think you know, so enjoy it while it lasts.
So if he was really making that video under the assumption that the viewer already knew all the stuff about Columbus that he was leaving out, why does he say in the intro that someone who doesn't know anything about Columbus is going to learn a lot from his video? Just doesn't add up, sorry.
After a few months of exploration around the Caribbean, he returned to Spain with several native Taino people with the outwardly expressed purpose of teaching them Latin and Christianity. Intent is a major theme of my original video and many of my other videos at the time. I've often told you the reasoning of the people involved without offering any counter-arguments or even my own personal feelings.
Okay, so as far as I know, Knowing Better has watched my response to his original video, where I specifically cover Columbus's intent and actually specifically quote a primary source, this one here, which is Columbus after returning from his first voyage, with those people who Knowing Better said that he only intended to teach Latin and Christianity and all that, where he enthusiastically offers the monarchs of Spain as many slaves as they would have him get. Apparently this wasn't worth mentioning. I mean, the omission of Columbus's involvement in the slave trade was possibly the biggest issue with his original video, and it was a big part of my response, but I guess it doesn't merit mention, even though it directly contradicts what he's saying Columbus's own intentions were here. In my response video, I went through an entire sort of progression on Columbus's personal thoughts on slavery. You know, how he got his ideas on slavery, the points at which he talked about slavery, the ways in which he specifically tried to push the Spanish monarchs towards slavery. And for a lot of this, you know, I used his own writings, which are about as close to showing us his intent as we can possibly get. But Knowing Better has an opportunity here to set the record straight. He's specifically making a new video to set the record straight here. And he just glosses over this again. He glosses over this entire very important fact about Columbus that most people don't really know about. And this was an opportunity for him to kind of expose his audience to the fact that, yes, Columbus was a very enthusiastic slave trader, and he intended to be a slave trader from the very beginning, pretty much. And I mean, I don't know, I think that he would be more careful considering that, as I said in my response, his Columbus video was being used as sort of a white nationalist propaganda piece sometimes. So I think it's kind of important that you mention these things in your sort of correction video to your original one. And you know, all I can do is sit here and think, why would he leave that out again? Why make the same massive glaring omission twice, man? Come on. If you don't want people making guesses at what your intentions are, then I think it's kind of important that you avoid this sort of thing. Because all I can do right now is kind of make guesses about, you know, why did he do this again? Even after he watched a video where a half a dozen quotes from Columbus saying, you know, slaves are good, here's some slaves. Hey, king and queen, you want some slaves? These people who brought you a good example of slaves. Blah, 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 all of that sort of stuff. And he just ignores it. What am I supposed to think, man? What is anyone supposed to think?
Whether Columbus intended to teach them Christianity or just wanted to kidnap them is irrelevant, because in the end, it looks the same.
Yeah, what he just said is true, so I guess props to him for acknowledging that, but no props to him for the other part, because, we don't need to speculate here on what Columbus intended, because he told us what he intended. He told us that he wanted to take slaves. And then he went and did it. This is not just us presenting two sides to every story here. We know what Columbus thought because he wrote about his thoughts, and we know that he wasn't playing around with them because he went and acted on those thoughts and initiated the transatlantic slave trade. Again, I don't understand why he isn't mentioning this. Why is the fact that Columbus was a huge slave trader just omitted? I wasn't just saying these things offhandedly, like Knowing Better kind of does a lot. I meticulously cited academic secondary sources and primary sources from Columbus's own journals and writings. So it's not like he even needs to acknowledge me here. He could just take the sources that I had and cite them here or something, but he doesn't. I'm at a loss.
Many people mark this as the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. However, I disagree on a purely semantic basis. The transatlantic slave trade typically refers to African slaves being transported across the Atlantic to be enslaved in America, not Americans being enslaved in America.
No, dude, no. Do you remember the video that you watched? Do you remember how I went over how Columbus actually did transport slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to Spain to be enslaved in Spain? That's why people say that it's the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. It's not because he enslaved American peoples in America, it's because he transported American peoples across the Atlantic Ocean to Spain. That is transatlantic slave trade. Again, this was another opportunity for him to inform his audience on something that Columbus did that is not only extremely important, but which was left out of his original video. And he just glosses over it and says that when people are talking about the transatlantic slave trade, they're talking about something else, which they're not. They're not, dude. When people talk about the transatlantic slave trade, they're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, which Columbus partook in by transporting slaves across the Atlantic to Spain. And just to reiterate, here's the part from my original video where I talk about this. Do you know who was the first guy to ever transport shipments of slaves across the Atlantic? It was Christopher Columbus. He wasn't just the first either. He was also the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. He shipped indigenous slaves from the Caribbean to Spain 5 times in 6 years. Which is just about as much as he possibly could have in such a short period of time, considering the length and difficulty of the journey. So that further demonstrates his enthusiasm for the slave trade. The first, as mentioned earlier, was a shipment of a few dozen slaves that he sent, unprompted, with a letter offering more. The second, in 1495, was a much larger shipment, the first ever large-scale movement of slaves across the Atlantic. He had intended to ship 1,600, but he could only manage to cram 550 into the 4 ships that he had available. Many of those who couldn't be loaded were instead given to the Europeans in the colony as slaves, showing that there was, actually, regular ownership-style slavery in the colony alongside the encomienda system. 200 of them died during the trip. Resendez writes that, with this voyage, Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates commonly associated with African slavery. The third, in 1496, was a shipment of 300 slaves. The fourth, in 1498, was a shipment of 800 slaves. The fifth, in 1499, was a shipment of 300 slaves again. That's about 2,000 slaves in 5 years. He did not simply suggest a brutal system of forced labor that was worse than slavery. He did not just try very hard to push the slave trade. He put it all into practice of his own accord.
This was the beginning of the encomienda system, which was similar to the feudal system of lords and peasants in Europe. People given an encomienda didn't own the people, they owned the land, and the people were just another feature on that land to be exploited.
Encomienda was not a grant of land, it was an allocation of a specific number of indigenous slaves / workers or whatever you want to call them. Again, I went over this in my original video, here's that section. What was an encomienda?
Well, it was an entitlement to forced labor by indigenous people. The encomendero, the holder of the encomienda, did not technically own the workers, but they were forced to work.
I don't understand how we can have an hour, 30-minute long resource right there with all of its sources clearly cited, which specifically corrected these claims that he made in his original video, and just ignore it to make the same claims again. Like, I don't know, this really seems like some kind of weird stubbornness or something. Like, okay dude, the Columbus video was one of your first. It sucked. You know, there's not really much redeeming qualities to it. You know, as I pretty emphatically showed, basically every point that he made in the video to support his argument was totally wrong. But I don't know, I guess he just can't bring himself to admit that for some reason. So he's just taking some of the things that he said in the original video that I specifically have already disproven and restating them as fact again. It's kind of weird, to be honest. I don't really know why he's doing that. And it's especially disappointing because he says in the beginning of this video that my response video is what has spurred him to, you know, do this reassessment of his original Columbus video. I don't know, it doesn't really seem like he's taken it to heart at all.
Near the end of his third voyage in 1500, the King and Queen of Spain replaced Columbus as governor, citing his inability to extract enough silver and gold, and his mistreatment of the Spanish colonists and native people. He was arrested, and during his journey back to Spain, he wrote a letter where he defends himself against various accusations, including the sexual slavery of 9-year-old girls. The context of that quote is him complaining about a thing happening and how that thing is harming his reputation. But that doesn't change the fact that it was still happening. He was in charge, and he wasn't really trying very hard to stop it. In fact, he may have even participated in it.
Look, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I already addressed this in my other video, where I not only specifically quoted that passage, showing that no, he was not complaining about that thing happening, but that he himself actively partook in that thing. And I cited numerous occasions where he and his men did this.
I also did a pretty poor job of explaining the translation section of my original video. I've regretted that since the day I uploaded it. If only I could use the power of 20/20 hindsight to... So the original intent of that section was to show how people can pick and choose different translations to convey whatever meaning they want. These two translations are derived from the same original sentence. One of them makes it seem like Columbus was personally power hungry, while the other makes it look like a suggestion, one of the many possible options for the king and queen to choose from regarding what to do with the islands. I obviously favor the second interpretation.
Look, as I explained in my original response, the second part here is not just a suggestion, that's just how someone would talk to a monarch. It's courtly sort of language. It's not that he's making a suggestion, it's that he has to frame every little sort of thing that he's saying to them, because, you know, they're monarchs, he's not allowed to make these sorts of direct statements to them. The first translation that Knowing Better shows here was basically translated from bullshit to what he actually meant. And not to mention that, as I showed in my video with a much more literal translation, the second translation here is actually not very good at all. Again, let's ignore that though, I guess.
The native people had been so decimated that by 1515, Bartolomé de las Casas gave up his encomienda and advocated for the importation of African slaves instead. Decades later, he said that that was a mistake, but the damage had already been done.
I gotta say, in Knowing Better's original video, he went to great lengths to delegitimize Bartolomé de las Casas. And in that original video, he specifically accused de las Casas of slavery, which, yeah, is true, while doing just about everything that he possibly could to absolve Columbus of the charge. But in this video, I'm seeing more of the same. Knowing Better just glossed over Columbus's involvement in the actual transatlantic slave trade, as I mentioned earlier. He doesn't quite directly accuse Columbus of slavery. He does place much more responsibility on Columbus than before for the encomienda system and its brutality. But again, he kind of falls short of directly accusing Columbus of slavery. But for de las Casas, he has, there's no impulse for him not to do so. He just goes right for it. Again, he's watched my video where it was really emphatically shown that Columbus specifically participated in the slave trade and that he was the impetus for it to start. But that doesn't bear mentioning while Bartolomé de las Casas' involvement, who is basically, a minor side character in this whole affair, does bear mentioning. It's the same thing again. So overall, what do I think about this response? Look, the issue with Knowing Better's original Columbus video was not just or even mostly in its approach. Far more than that is the fact that it's simply factually incorrect at best, and lies by omission at worst. So for him to make another video where he repeats a lot of the same glaring factual errors and makes many of the same omissions is really just not okay, especially since I know for a fact that he's watched my response video that corrects a lot of these problems. Why leave out the fact that Columbus was an unambiguous slave trader who talked about slavery all the time with a ton of enthusiasm? Why ignore the entire segment explaining why Columbus was the first transatlantic slave trader to instead mischaracterize the position of people who say that? Why go so far to just avoid calling a spade, dude? Like, yeah, Knowing Better was saying that Columbus deserves responsibility and all of that, but he stops well short of actually admitting that he was wrong about these things. Admitting that he was wrong on the individual facts, admitting that he omitted extremely important evidence. Most people don't know that Columbus was the first transatlantic slave trader. Most people don't know that Columbus wrote so much about slavery. Most people don't know that he specifically tried to push the Spanish crown towards the slave trade. To leave all of this out after watching my video that stresses all of this, I don't know, why? I think the most charitable interpretation here is that Knowing Better simply doesn't want to admit that he didn't really know that much about Columbus, that he was actually quite wrong on many of the basic historical facts. So he's simply focusing solely on the approach, rather than simply coming out and admitting that he really did get many of the basic facts wrong, and that he specifically omitted a lot of the most damning evidence against Columbus, probably because he simply didn't know of its existence. Anyway, that's my take on this. Quite disappointed, but well, what can you do?